September 1913, Ireland and Revolution. In this lecture, I just want to say a few brief things about this poem, September 1913, in relation to our course. We've been tracing Yeats's artistic development from his early flirtation with outright republicanism through a more ambivalent qualification of the merits of sacrifice and illegitimate violence, as we've been calling it, with the legitimate, illegitimate in scare quotes. And in 1910, he published the poem Upon a House Shaken by the Land Agitation. There we saw him beginning to cultivate an affiliation with the landed gentry of Ireland. He had indicted the Catholic majority in Ireland for their obsession, their preoccupation with marriage and money in Kathleen Ni Houlihan. The idea being that they needed to wean themselves from these English preoccupations inherited from the colonial occupier, and regenerate themselves through blood sacrifice. It was a call to arms, Kathleen Ni Houlihan. Even as Ellmann informs us that Yeats's interest in politics was never particularly practical, and an amount of his interest in republicanism was triangulated through his desire to court Maud Gonne, who was herself a Republican, but very much in the active mode. By the time of Upon the House Shaken by Land Agitation, we saw how Yeats was beginning to cultivate a myth of the Anglo-Irish, where passion and precision have been one time out of mind, as the preferred rulers of the Irish, because, he says, or implies, cultivating English stereotypes, that the Irish cannot govern themselves because they're too impractical, and that they cannot be governed by England because the English are too practical, but also it's a colonial occupation. So rather than having the English rule Ireland or the Irish rule themselves, he implies that the Anglo-Irish should continue to do the job, which they've been doing, he says, time out of mind. Well, of course, that's a mischievous quote, because the Irish did not consider the Anglo-Irish to have been in Ireland time out of mind. They remembered very well when they arrived in successive waves of plantation, culminating in the Cromwellian settlement, which sent masses of Irish west into Connaught, where they developed a monoculture of dependency on the potato, in a culture of subdivision of land leading to a population explosion that then led to megadeath during the famine. We've seen Yeats increasingly using then the Irish Republican tradition to his own ends, and September 1913 is no exception. The relevant poem is Thomas Davis's The Green Above the Red. And in this poem, you'll see the usual set of preoccupations of the young Ireland ballad tradition. Rebellion, they rose in rude but fierce array, the idea of the raggle-taggle band of Irish rebels heroically facing down the English colonial armies. You'll see the evocation of Irish shame, the shame of colonial submission. He also name calls a number of heroes from the 1798 rebellion, including Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Wolfe Tone. Sure 'twas for this Lord Edward died and Wolfe Tone sunk serene. And you'll also see at the end of Thomas Davis's ballad the usual call for the renewal of Irish dignity through blood sacrifice. And 'tis for this we think and toil and knowledge strive to glean, that we may pull the English red below the Irish green, and leave our sun's sweet liberty in smiling plenty spread, above the land once dark with blood, the green above the red. So in this poem we see once again all of the elements of the Republican ballad ideology that we've studied. If you go to September 1913, you'll see how Yeats name calls the same heroes in the same way, asking the question, or rather, Thomas Davis makes the statement, sure 'twas for this Lord Edward died and Wolfe Tone sunk serene. Yeats turns that back into a question, turning the question effectively back on the Irish people. Was it for this the wild geese spread, the grey wing upon every tide, For this that all that blood was shed, for this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet, and Wolfe Tone, all that delirium of the brave. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. The great opening of the poem, what need you being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, is an indictment of the Irish as once again preoccupied with money, with getting on in the world, and with Catholicism. That in effect, the Irish had ignored Yeats's call to sacrifice in Kathleen Ní Houlihan and had consummated their marriage to English values, to English materialism and utilitarianism. Yeats is in an argument with English values, triangulated through an argument with the Irish people. And in this phase of his career, most of his great poems are centered around indignant questions. Was it for this? What need you? And you remember that the land agitation poem is formed entirely of questions. This is when Yeats takes on the mantle of the public poet, but he does it to mobilize a fairly spiteful and personal agenda against the Irish, which is, in part at least, an argument with Maud Gonne about politics and republicanism. But here, he's suggesting that romantic Ireland's dead and gone, and that they have embraced English material values, and that John O'Leary, Yeats's great Fenian hero, was the last great embodiment of Irish heroism. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. The final verse of the poem, yet could we turn the years again and call those exiles as they were in all their loneliness and pain, you'd cry some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. Here I think we can see a reference back to Kathleen Ní Houlihan, bearing in mind the extraordinary effect of the strange old woman on Michael Gillan in that play, that in fact he was maddened or entranced or enchanted by her, and this led him to an estrangement from the familiar world of the Gillan household. So what Yeats is doing here is returning to Kathleen Ní Houlihan and saying, all of these people who have sacrificed themselves for Ireland died for nothing, because you're too preoccupied with money, pounds and pence. And even if these people did come back, you would actually take the side against the strange old woman, against Kathleen Ní Houlihan and the cause of Ireland, and on behalf of the Gillan family. So bizarrely here, Yeats is indicting Ireland against itself in its relationship to the cult of republicanism, saying that the Irish are not republican enough, that they refused the calls for sacrifice and embraced petty bourgeois values. The background to this particular poem, and if you want a brief account of it, you can go to Roy Foster's biography of Yeats, Volume 1, The Apprentice Mage, is what was known as the Hugh Lane controversy. Hugh Lane was a shipping magnate and an art collector who had offered a significant collection of contemporary art to the Irish people if they would fund a gallery to house it. And they had a magnificent design for a gallery that was going to stretch over the River Liffey, like the Bridge of Sighs in Venice. However, the issue got caught up in a number of wranglings at local politicians' level, the Dublin Corporation, concerns about cost and so forth. And in the end, for numerous reasons, the plan fell through. For Yeats, this was proof of the cravenness of the Irish, their chauvinism, and their backwardness in relation to culture. And for a long time, Yeats's preoccupation as an artist was, of course, with artistic value. And he thought the Irish too interested in petty bourgeois values to ever cultivate the aesthetic sense. He became increasingly interested in the work of the Irish conservative Edmund Burke, who saw people he saw humankind as an aesthetic species that craved aesthetic experiences of the sublime and the beautiful. But the Irish now were increasingly showing themselves to be mere animals in this sense. He spoke, and here's a quote from Yeats: "There is a moment in the history of every nation when it is plastic, when it is like wax, when it is ready to hold for generations the shape that is given to it. Ireland is now plastic and will be for a few years to come. The intellectual workers in Ireland see gathering against them all the bigotries of Dublin that have succeeded in keeping the golden treasury out of the schools, the bigotries of Belfast that have turned Nietzsche out of the public libraries. If Hugh Lane is defeated, hundreds of young men and women all over the country will be discouraged, will choose a poorer idea of what might be. If the intellectual movement is defeated, Ireland will for many years become a little huckstering nation, groping for halfpence in a greasy till. It is that or the fulfillment of her better dreams. The choice is yours and ours." Yeats loved to pitch the idea that Ireland was at a crossroads. You'll see it in early essays like Hopes and Fears for Ireland that we studied in relation to degeneration theory and decadent art. And he's suggesting here that the litmus test of Irish civilization and progress, the civilizing process as applied to the Irish people, is their relationship to art. The Golden Treasury was a famous anthology of verse that had been kept out of Irish schools for fear of contaminating them with English poetry and values. So you'll see how what Yeats is saying in this poem, the link here being the groping for halfpence in a greasy till, the great idea of the Irish as having just the fat of their fingers scrape the bottom of the cash register as they make their little deals. The link here is materialism. So when you go back to September 1913 to read it, what need you, the Irish people, being come to sense, the idea that they're developing national consciousness, is that you have a choice of what kind of nation you want to be. And Yeats has already decided, in effect, that the Irish are beyond help. They're beyond help because they're enthralled to the bishops and to the banks. And this will become the defining note of this great middle period of his career. In Pethica, you'll see other poems, To a Friend Whose Work Has Come to Nothing, and Páudín. And these poems are all part of this argument with the petty bourgeoisie, indignant at the fumbling wits, the obscure spite of our old Páudín in his shop. And he tells his friend Hugh Lane to forget about Ireland, be secret and exult. He claims again that the reason why Hugh Lane ought to forget the Irish people and give up his hopes for them is because he is one being honor bred. In other words, he's one of the aristocratic classes. And Yeats is increasingly inclined to elevate aristocracy above the bourgeoisie and the Irish people generally. So that's September 1913.